Appendix. Aisha's marriage and her age. Much has been said about Aisha, the Prophet's wife, and her age at the time when she married the Prophet. In this appendix, we will try to establish the truth, relying on authentic reports and looking at Aisha's attitude in certain situations and her reaction to various events. 1. The first thing we have to remember is that at the time when the Prophet received his message and began to advocate it, most Arabs were unlettered. He himself could not read or write. Moreover, the Arabs had no recognized calendar. They dated matters in reference to major events that affected their lives. Hence, dating changed after each new major event. For example, the Prophet is said to have been born in the year of the elephant, which refers to the time when Abraha, the ruler of Yemen, led a large army headed by an elephant aiming to destroy the Kaaba. The Arabs had no registry of births and deaths. Hence, any mention of people's ages during that period should be taken as approximate. To give an example, several contemporaries of the Prophet who attained to old age, such as Abdul Muttalib, the Prophet's grandfather, and the two famous poets, Hassan ibn Thabit and al-Nabiga al-Juwaidi, are said to have lived 120 years. None of them is said to have lived 115 or 125 years, but all have the round figure of 120. Moreover, we often have various figures mentioned of the same person's age. The Prophet's first wife, Khadija, is often said to have been 40 years of age when she married the Prophet. Yet, she gave him 6 children, which suggests that she was in the prime of her reproductive life. A woman of 40 may beget a child or two, but to give birth to 6 children over a period of 10 years is extremely unlikely. When we consider that other reports put her age at the time of her marriage at 45, 35, 30, 28, and even 25, with all these figures mentioned in the same book, we realize that none of them can be taken as absolutely reliable. Besides, Arab and Muslim historians of the early period often concentrated on the event far more than on its timing. They often reported the event without mentioning its time. All this tends to confuse dates and blur time factors. Inevitably, in this state of affairs, people's ages cannot be accurate. 2. The view commonly held is that Aisha was 6 when the Prophet proposed to marry her, and she was 9 when the actual marriage took place. We contend that this is inaccurate. The first thing which we need to consider when we attempt to determine Aisha's age at the point of her marriage to the Prophet is the fact that prior to her marriage, she was engaged to Jubair ibn Mut'im. When Abu Bakr, her father, was told that the Prophet wanted to marry her, he said, "The Mut'im family have already spoken of her for their son. I will skillfully pull her out of that." This tells us that the engagement was a firm one, since Aisha's father needed to employ clever tactics to rescind it. It could not have been merely a question of casual conversation between the two families. 3. Let us now look at how the idea of the Prophet's marriage to Aisha came about. The Prophet had married Khadija when he was in his early or mid-20s. They lived happily together for 25 years. Khadija gave her husband 2 sons, both of whom died in infancy, and 4 daughters. At the start of his mission, the Prophet's eldest daughter, Zainab, was married to Abu al-As ibn al-Rabi, while the second, Ruqayya, and the third, Kulthum, were engaged to Utbah and Utayba, sons of his uncle, Abu Lahab. In his determined opposition to the new message, Abu Lahab ordered his 2 sons to break their engagements, which they did. Ruqayya then married Uthman ibn Affan. When, at the Prophet's advice, some of the early Muslims emigrated to Abyssinia in year 5 of the start of Islam, Uthman and Ruqayya were the first to act on this advice and traveled to Abyssinia. 5 years later, for instance in year 10 of the start of Islamic revelations, and 3 years before the Muslims' emigration to Medina, Khadija died. It was after her death that Khawla bint Hakim, one of the early Muslim women, realized that Khadija's death was a great loss to the Prophet. It left a vacuum in his life. He lost the woman who ensured that he had a happy and comfortable home where he could forget the determined hospitality most people in Mecca showed him. She was his main support and provided him with solace and encouragement. Khola, therefore, went to the Prophet with the suggestion that he should find himself a new wife. When he showed interest, she asked, "Which do you prefer, a mature woman or a virgin?" He asked her who she had in mind. She said, "The mature woman is Sauda bint Zimma, and the virgin is Aisha, your friend's daughter." The Prophet told her to carry his proposals of marriage to both of them. The Prophet then married Sauda shortly afterwards and married Aisha 3 years later after his migration to Medina. When Khola went to Abu Bakr with the proposal, he made clear that he would be breaking Aisha's engagement to Jubair ibn Mut'im. It is to be noted that neither the Prophet nor Abu Bakr and his family spoke of Aisha being too young for marriage. Yet, the Prophet made this very comment on 2 occasions when 2 of his companions came with proposals to marry his youngest daughter, Fatima. The question that arises here is, could Khola, who seems to be a Muslim woman with foresight, recognizing the effects of the loss of his wife on the Prophet, have suggested to him a child of age 6 who was several years younger than the youngest of his 4 daughters? How could such a child compensate for the loss of Khadija? Was it not more likely that she would be an added burden to the Prophet if she were to move into his home? Yet Khola did not envisage that if the Prophet chose Aisha, the marriage would be delayed. She was suggesting something to be carried out without delay, as was clear in the case of Sauda. Moreover, when she made her suggestion, she had no idea that the Prophet would choose to marry both women. She came with the suggestion any thoughtful and mature woman would make, that the Prophet should marry someone who could provide him with some of the comfort Khadija used to provide. Her short list included 2 names from whom one was to be chosen. Had it been true that Aisha was only 6 years of age, the very mention of her name in this context at that time would be exceedingly odd. A girl of 6 would have been in need of looking after, not assigned the task of looking after a man with the most difficult task in history. It must always be remembered that had she been 6 at the time, Aisha would have been younger than the youngest of the Prophet's daughters, of whom 2 were still living with him. 4. Another clue to Aisha's age is the time when she adopted the Islamic faith. In his biography of the Prophet, which is the earliest detailed one, Ibn Ishaq lists 51 names under the heading, "The people who accepted God's messenger's message in its early days." The list does not include any children. Ali, who was only 10 or 12 when he embraced Islam, had already been mentioned and was not included in the list. A large number of those mentioned in this list were among the Prophet's companions who emigrated to Abyssinia in the 5th year of the start of the Islamic message. The number of the emigrants at the time was 101, while the number of all Muslims was around 200. Hence, it is reasonable to assume that all those included in the list embraced Islam well before it was in its 5th year. Numbers 18 and 19 on this list are given to Asma bint Abu Bakr and her sister Aisha, who was young at the time. The comment is Ibn Ishaq's. We forego any significance that the listing order may suggest, but it is very significant that Aisha is the only young person mentioned in the list. Had she been 9 years of age at the time of her wedding, she would have been only 1 year old at the time we are talking about. We need make no comment. However, there is plenty of evidence that Aisha accepted Islam in its early days. If we say that she was 10 when she adopted Islam, and we put that event in the 5th year of Islam, she would be 19 at the time of her marriage. Yet, Ibn Ishaq might have been speaking of a 12-year-old who adopted Islam soon after her parents adopted it. That would make her age on her wedding a few years over 20. 5. Had it been true that Aisha was 9 at the time of her wedding, she would have been 8 at the time of the Prophet's migration to Medina, accompanied by her father Abu Bakr. Yet, consider this report by Aisha. It was God's messenger's habit to call at Abu Bakr's house at either end of day, morning, or evening. However, on the day when he received God's permission to migrate, leaving Makkah and his people, he came to us around midday, which was very unusual for him. On seeing him, Abu Bakr said, "Something serious must have brought God's messenger at this time." When the Prophet came inside, Abu Bakr left his place for him, and the Prophet sat down. No one was there other than my sister Asma and myself. But the Prophet said to Abu Bakr, "Let everyone here go out." Abu Bakr said, "God's messenger, these are my 2 daughters. What is the matter?" The Prophet said, God has given me instructions to migrate. Abu Bakr said, May I be your companion on this trip? The Prophet said, Yes, we will be together. By God, I never realized before that day that anyone could weep out of joy until I saw Abu Bakr weeping then. He then said, Prophet, I have here 2 riding camels I have prepared for this purpose. Aisha is talking here about something she witnessed shortly before the Prophet's migration to Medina. Her marriage to the Prophet took place a year or longer after the Prophet's settlement in Medina. Had she been 9 at the time of her marriage, she would have been 8 or less when this conversation and reaction took place. Would a child of 7 or 8 distinguish the cause of her father's weeping, joy, or sadness? The natural reaction of such a child is to run to her father, feeling agitated and confused. Yet Aisha was sure that her father was weeping out of joy. Moreover, the Prophet was keen to keep his departure from Makkah secret. When people are planning something and want it to remain secret, they would make sure that their young children would not know of it for fear that a child would not realize the danger involved in communicating the secret to other people. Indeed, when the Quraysh people realized that the Prophet and Abu Bakr had slipped away, Abu Jahl called at Abu Bakr's place and asked his daughter Asma where her father was. When she said she did not know, he slapped her on the face. Had Aisha been 8 years of age, the Prophet and her father would not have let her stay and learn that they were leaving. 6. Another example of Aisha's reaction to events that is indicative of her status may be cited from the story of falsehood, which is discussed in detail in chapter 24, pages 414 to 427. A false rumor was circulated by hypocrites concerning Aisha. The rumor suggested that she had been involved with a young companion of the Prophet called Safwan ibn al-Mu'attal. For a whole month, the rumor circulated and the Prophet could not do anything to establish the truth of the matter. Aisha was ill for most of the month, and she was moved to her parents' home to be nursed. Visiting her there, the Prophet told her to repent if she had done any wrong. She asked her parents to speak for her, but each of them said that they could not say anything to the Prophet. She remained defiant, unwilling to say anything in her own defense. She was absolutely certain of her innocence, and she hoped that God would make that clear to all. At that moment, the Prophet received Quranic revelations confirming Aisha's innocence. It is her reaction to this particular situation that should be taken into account. This event took place in the 5th year of the Prophet's migration to Medina. For instance, 3 or 4 years after his marriage to Aisha. Had she truly been only 9 when she married, she would have been 12 or 13 when all this took place. Let us look at the details. Here we have a wife at the center of a rumor accusing her of adultery. Her parents cannot say a word in her defense. Her husband, who is God's messenger, comes and tells her that if she had done it, she should repent and seek God's forgiveness. What would a 13-year-old girl feel under all this pressure? Yet, Aisha remains defiant, strong in her belief in her innocence. Then, to everyone's relief, all is cleared and divine revelations declare her innocent. The Prophet tells her that. Her mother immediately says to her, "Go up to him." This is the attitude of a mother when all doubt surrounding her daughter is cleared and her marriage is safe. Aisha defiantly says, "No, by God, I shall not go up to him. I will thank only God for declaring my innocence." Here, we see a mature woman taking issue with her husband. She does not look at the Prophet as God's messenger, but as her husband. Her words carry a strong element of remonstration. It is as if she is saying, "How could you entertain any thoughts that I could be guilty? Should you not have shown more trust in me? How could you ask other people about my faithfulness? Do you not know your wife?" This is certainly not the attitude of a 13-year-old girl. It is more like a mature woman, at least in her early 20s, to take such an attitude, stressing her integrity and faithfulness while remonstrating with her husband. 7. The Battle of Uhud was an important event in Islamic history, as it gave Muslims a very important practical lesson. It showed the Prophet's companions and all future Muslim communities that God does not grant them victory simply because they profess to be Muslim. They have to fulfill their duties as good Muslims before they are granted God's help. At Uhud, the Muslims suffered their first reversal in a military encounter with the unbelievers. Shortly before the battle, the Prophet inspected his troops. He saw a number of youths among them. He ordered everyone who was below the age of 15 to return to Medina. 1 or 2 were 14, but even then the Prophet ordered them to go back. They participated with the Muslim army the following year when the allied forces of the unbelievers and the Jews tried to invade Medina in an effort to eradicate Islam. When the Prophet went on a military expedition, a number of women traveled with the army. They provided auxiliary services such as nursing the wounded and giving support. In the Battle of Uhud, some of them actually fought with the Muslims. We have several reports about the heroics shown by Nasiba bint Ka'b as she took part in repelling the unbelievers' determined attempt to kill the Prophet. The Battle of Uhud took place in the month of Shawwal of the 3rd year of the Prophet's settlement in Medina, for instance, 2 years or less after Aisha's marriage. Consider the following hadith, which is related by Al-Bukhari under several headings. Anas reports, when the Muslim army was in retreat during the Battle of Uhud and people moved away from the Prophet, I saw Aisha and Sulaim having lifted their skirts, and I could see the lower parts of their legs. They were carrying water skins on their backs and almost running to give people to drink before going back to refill their containers with water and come back to pour it in people's mouths. Related by Al-Bukhari and Muslim. Had she been 9 at the time of her marriage, she would be 11 or even younger when that battle took place. Can we imagine that the Prophet, who did not permit young men of 14 to stay with the army, would have allowed a girl of 11 to stay? 8. Another factor that indicates Aisha's age is her knowledge. She was known for the breadth of her knowledge and her confident expression of her views. She never hesitated in stating her disagreement with some of the most learned companions of the Prophet. Badr al-Din al-Zarkashi devoted a book to explain all the points in which Aisha disputed the views or rulings other companions of the Prophet expressed. He says in his introduction, I have listed in this book the views of Aisha, may God be pleased with her, in which she stands alone in disagreement with all other scholars, whether based on personal opinion or relying on a proper practice by the Prophet or on sound knowledge unavailable to others, and cases where she disputed the views of her contemporary scholars, or where some scholars of high standing deferred to her opinion, or where she cited evidence for her rulings, or for which she provided a weightier argument. Al-Zarkashi then lists a total of 59 cases, explaining them all. In these, she disagrees with no less than 23 of the most prominent scholars among the Prophet's companions, including Umar ibn al-Khattab, Ali ibn Abi Talib, and Abdullah ibn Abbas. Aisha had the basic education young girls in Makkah received at the time, but she benefited by the fact that she belonged to a broad-minded family and her father was the Prophet's closest friend. Then she learned most of her knowledge from the Prophet. Needless to say, her knowledge was mostly concerned with Islam and its teachings. Had she been only 9 years of age when she married the Prophet, she would have been 18 when he passed away. During such period, young scholars absorb whatever they are taught. Their critical views of what they have learnt develop later on. It takes effort on the part of both teacher and student before such critical examination of one's learning begins to take expression. Aisha's knowledge suggests that she was such a critical scholar, which means that she was several years older than what is generally assumed. 9. Can we determine the year when Aisha was born? We must say at the outset that this is not easy, considering what we said earlier about the Arabs having no fixed reference point by which they dated events and births. However, there are indications that give a good insight into that. The first is that Al-Tabari, a highly respected historian of the 3rd century of the Islamic era, mentions in his voluminous history that Abu Bakr, Aisha's father, had 4 children, 2 by each of his 2 wives, and that all his children were born before Islam. Aisha's marriage took place at least 14 years after the message of Islam started to be revealed. Secondly, it is confirmed that Asma, Aisha's sister, who was 10 years older, died in 73 AH, and it is stated that she was 100 years of age, if not older. We cannot say for certain that she was 100, or that the difference between the two was 10 years, but if these 2 pieces of information were correct, then Aisha was born 4 or 5 years before Islam, and she was 18 or 19 at the time of her marriage. Another clue to the time of Aisha's birth is the report that Abu Bakr was 28 at the time when he married Aisha's mother, Roman. Abu Bakr was 2 years younger than the Prophet, which means that he was 38 at the time of the start of the Islamic message. In other words, he married his second wife 10 years before Islam. We do not have any reports about his having any other children who might have died in infancy. It is reasonable to assume that his 2 children were born within the first 5 years of his marriage. This means that Aisha's birth was at least 5 years before the start of Islam, making her 19 or 20 at the time of her marriage. 10. With all this evidence to hand, how come that people always repeat that she was 6 at the time of her engagement to the Prophet and 9 when the marriage took place? The answer is that this information is mentioned in a hadith. I do not wish to discuss the subject of hadith acceptability and the degree of authenticity that we can attach to each hadith. However, we may state that each hadith has 2 parts, a chain of transmission consisting of the reporters who transmitted it and the text attributed to the Prophet or to one of his companions. Hadith scholars concentrated mainly on the chain of transmission, while scholars of Islamic jurisprudence, for instance fiqh, examine the text of each hadith. If a hadith text is free of a clear defect, they accept it as correct, provided that the chain of transmission is acceptable. Scholars of hadith established a very sophisticated system for the acceptability of reporters so as to judge each chain of transmission and grade every hadith accordingly. The hadith that mentions Aisha's age being 9 at the time of her marriage includes Hisham ibn Urwa ibn al-Zubair ibn al-Awam as the main reporter. Hisham is graded as reliable by scholars of hadith. However, they warn that during his stay in Iraq in his later life, he was generally lax in reporting what he had heard from his father. This means that what he reported earlier when he was in Hijaz is accepted as authentic, while his later reporting left something to be desired. All the versions that we have from Hisham concerning Aisha's age belong to this category. Hence, we can say that they are countered by much stronger evidence, and we cannot accept this hadith as perfectly authentic. Conclusion. When we take all this evidence into consideration, we are bound to reject the statement that Aisha was as young as 9 at the time of her marriage to the Prophet. We say that most probably she was around 20, perhaps 1 or 2 years younger or older. While some of the evidence we cited is based on logical argument, some has stronger basis, such as the way the marriage proposal came about and her presence at Uhud. Yet, there will remain many people who will say that Aisha was as young as 9 at the time. Such people are of 3 types. The first type includes people who are hostile to Islam. They try to detract from the Prophet's character using whatever ammunition they can find. No doubt such a report provides them with much ammunition. These we will not try to answer because their hostility will always blind them to the truth. The other 2 types are Muslims, but one group will cling to what they have learned in childhood and will find anything that challenges old established information too difficult to accept. The other group includes traditional scholars who find it hard to reject a hadith when it is listed in one of the authentic anthologies. Both groups will try hard to justify themselves in believing that this marriage took place when Aisha was 9. They will come up with arguments like girls attaining puberty at a very early age in the hot climate of Arabia. Their efforts cannot yield any fruits. Such arguments will not prove anything other than the difficulty they find in examining long-held views. We rest our case.